Hey everyone, so I covered in a video, I think it was yesterday, that the US government may sell 69,000 Bitcoin that they confiscated from a black market website back in 2013, actually 2014, so it was 10 years ago. And somebody asked me a fantastic question, just a fantastic question, which was, isn't it a good thing that those Bitcoin are going back into circulation? So that's actually a complicated question because there's pros and cons, and I'll cover them right here. So on the one hand, is it a good thing? Well, do I want centralized coercive monopoly powers, which are governments, which I'm not a fan of in their current form? I'm a fan of governance, but not centralized coercive monopoly governments, which is what we have to work with. So do I want them to own the most precious monetary system in or the representation of the most precious and valuable monetary system in the world, which is Bitcoin? And the answer is no. Why would I want centralized coercive monopoly powers to have something so valuable as Bitcoin? And so on that hand, yes, I would prefer that central, governments divest themselves of that value just so they don't have it, and that power and value can be in the hands of the people. So that's sort of one argument in favor of the government selling the Bitcoin. An argument in favor of them keeping the Bitcoin, which most people would agree is stronger, is that even if you don't want the government to have Bitcoin, there is a huge benefit to Bitcoiners with the government being on your side of the table as an owner of the asset rather than some entity that wants to attack the asset because they don't own the asset. So when you compare those two things side by side, is it better for the government to own some of the Bitcoin and be advocating in favor of it alongside you because they're on the same side of the table with the same incentives? That is a strong argument in favor of the government keeping Bitcoin and setting up a strategic Bitcoin reserve and holding any Bitcoin they have and not selling them. And I think that is a much stronger argument than the argument that we don't want the government to own any of it because otherwise they can dump the Bitcoin on a moment's notice and try to crash the price, even though that's only temporary. It has some effect if the government wakes up one day and they own 1% of the Bitcoin and they just try to sell it all at one time. Obviously, that's disruptive to the market in the near term, even if it's irrelevant in the long term. So I would say there's a strong case to be made that having the incentives aligned by central banks and governments owning Bitcoin along with the rest of us, there is a strong case that that is a very good thing. There is a case, but a weaker case, that we just don't want the government to own assets that have value because they are centralized coercive monopoly powers, and they will tend to use those assets badly and potentially against the citizens, which always seems to eventually happen one way or the other. But there's a second part to the question, which is in the sort of the opener to this, which is, don't we want those Bitcoins back in circulation? So this is actually interesting because there's a complicated interplay here to answer that question. So one, does Bitcoin need those Bitcoin back in circulation in order to operate properly? The answer is no. The nature of a money is that any amount of a money, as long as it's hard to make more of, is enough. So a gold standard could work if there was twice as much gold. It could also work as long as there's half as much gold. You just need some reasonable amount of it that it's divisible enough. So all that really matters is how divisible the entity is. So in the case of gold, if gold was extremely rare and there was only 1 pound of gold for the whole earth, the issue is that to try to divide it where, to represent small denominations of value would have such a tiny speck of gold that you couldn't even see it. So obviously that's a problem. But as long as something is divisible enough, it's not a problem. So it actually doesn't matter. Bitcoin would work completely fine if there were 10 million coins, or if there was 15 million or 21 million, just like there is. It would also work just as fine if there was 30 million or 42 million. What matters is that the absolute number is known and that it does not change. So the value of Bitcoin comes from the fact that there's only 21 million, that there was 21 million the day it was invented, and that there will never be more than 21 million, and that we know exactly the rate at which those 21 million will be issued into the marketplace. And right now, about between 94 and 95% of all the Bitcoin that will ever exist are already in circulation, and the remaining 5 or 6% will be released through the Bitcoin mining process over the next 116 years, 116, between now and 2140. which is 116 years away. So for any asset, what matters is not the absolute number, it's how much is there, how much is left to be mined, and do we know those numbers, and is it stable, and is it divisible enough? So from is there enough Bitcoin, we absolutely do not need those Bitcoin from the government in order for Bitcoin to work properly. It just doesn't matter whether they're in circulation or not. Okay, but that begs another question. What happens when somebody, let's say, owns 1%, which is what the U.S. government owns right now? 1% of 21 million is 210,000. The U.S. government owns, I think, 216,000. So they own just over 1%. And the new Bitcoin that they were authorized to sell, or not the new, but of those 216,000 coins, the new ones that they are sort of newly authorized to potentially sell is 69,000, which is obviously just a portion of that 216,000. So let's round down and assume the U.S. government had 210,000, because that makes it exactly 1%, which is basically almost exactly, maybe with a slight rounding error, it's about 1% anyway. So the question is, what happens if the U.S. government keeps the 1% of Bitcoin they own and never touches it for the rest of eternity? The answer is, the Bitcoin, because the ratio between the total number of Bitcoin and the total number of goods and services that could be bought with that Bitcoin has to be even. It means if there's 1% less Bitcoin in circulation, that the other 99% of the Bitcoin is all 1% more valuable. And the reason for that is now you've only got 99% as much Bitcoin, but the same amount of goods and services that could be purchased with Bitcoin, and therefore everybody's Bitcoin is worth 1% more. So what happens then if the U.S. government all of a sudden dumps 1% of the Bitcoin they own, so they own zero? So suddenly there's 210,000 extra Bitcoin dumped into the marketplace and in circulation. And the answer is, because then there is now 1% more Bitcoin in circulation that is being actively traded and is now chasing goods and services, just like the 99% was before. Now it's 100%. The answer is, or let's say it was 100%, now it's 101%. I know that math doesn't make sense. So I guess let's call it 99% and 1% was off the market because the U.S. government owned it, and then they dump it. So now it's back to 100% Bitcoin in circulation. And the answer is the purchasing power of all of the Bitcoin, the other Bitcoin, drops by 1% because now they are, or I should say the prices or what they can buy now requires 1% more Bitcoin because there's now 1% more Bitcoin in circulation. The same thing happens if somebody loses their Bitcoin. So, if somebody loses their private keys, which is not really something that happens anymore, but it used to happen in the early days of Bitcoin. If somebody loses Bitcoin and loses their ability to control it, or on purpose, they purposefully lose it where nobody can access it and, the person dies or something like that. The answer is because that Bitcoin is now off the market, it is slightly deflationary as compared to all of the other Bitcoin, which means the purchasing power of all of the remaining Bitcoin goes up slightly. So Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin, actually said in one of his early posts when somebody said, but wait, what happens if somebody has, let's call it 1% of the Bitcoin, and then they die and they, don't leave the keys to anybody and they didn't have it on BitKey or Coinbase or anywhere and it's just gone forever. And Satoshi Nakamoto said, well, it's basically a gift to the entire rest of the Bitcoin community because it means, in that instant that Bitcoin became permanently lost, that everybody else's Bitcoin is now worth 1% more. Because again, now there's 99% as much Bitcoin. There's the same amount of goods and services. And so now it takes 1% less Bitcoin to buy any goods or services. And that would be reflected in a 1% price increase, as measured in US dollars as compared to the Bitcoin. So, you'll see actually that the way that plays out, because even in the last day or two, the price of Bitcoin went from about, $63,000 down to about $60,000 based on news that the U.S. government might sell the 69,000 Bitcoin. Obviously, the math is not exact. It's not like if you sell, 0.1%, the price changes 0.1%. That may be what happens, in the long term, when the whole world's on a Bitcoin standard. But there's always a mathematical ratio, but it's not 1-to-1. It's always, 25 to 1, 118 to 1, 50 to 1 for a variety of reasons. I'm happy to explain if anyone's curious. But anyway, so all that to say, when it was announced that they might sell those Bitcoin, the price came down, because now it means there's going to be more Bitcoin in circulation, and that means the dollar price of Bitcoin goes down. And then today, the price is back above 63,000 a coin. And part of the reason for that is Mt. Gox, back from also 2014, 10 years ago. Mt. Gox announced that some of the Bitcoin that they were going to return as part of a hack that happened 10 years ago in 2014 would not actually be returned until 2025. So there again, people are saying, oh, we anticipated that there was going to be a couple billion more Bitcoin floating around, but now we don't have to worry about that Bitcoin until 2025, which means the purchasing power, measured in US dollars, of the remaining Bitcoin is now all worth more. So that is the way that works. Any amount, to recap here, any amount of a scarce resource is enough as long as it's divisible enough, meaning it can be divided into small enough pieces that don't become either too small to see or too small to measure. And Bitcoin does not have that problem because it's mathematical, so you can, measure and see any amount. So any amount of Bitcoin is the right amount as long as you know in advance and it's not changing. And the amount of new Bitcoin that is issued each year, in the case of Bitcoin, it's about 0.75%. So 0.75% of new Bitcoin is issued every year right now, and that drops in half every 4 years. So that will drop in half in 2028. It dropped in half from 1.5% down to 0.75% earlier this year. So as long as you know how much there is, then any amount is the right amount. And do we want nation states owning Bitcoin? Yes, and we would rather them hold it because it aligns incentives, and that's better, I think, probably most people would agree, that's better than the government not owning Bitcoin and being adversarial toward it because it's not something that they own and they're not on the same side of the fence as Bitcoiners. And then last of all is, do we need any particular Bitcoin in circulation like what the US government owns? And the answer is no. The economy will be just fine if the government sells that 69,000 Bitcoin. The Bitcoin economy will also be fine if they hold on to it forever. It's just a question of if they hold on to obviously 69,000 Bitcoin is not 1% because 210,000 is, so it's a fraction of 1%. But let's say it is 1%. If the United States government, which already owns just over 1%, if they dump all of that Bitcoin, the only effect is there's 1% more Bitcoin in circulation, which means the purchasing power of that Bitcoin is 1% less because there's more Bitcoin chasing the same amount of goods and services. Conversely, if they decide to sit on that Bitcoin forever and never spend it, it has the reverse effect, which means the Bitcoin that's currently in circulation is all 1% more valuable because it's not competing with that 1% that the government's holding to buy goods and services. There's basically 1% less Bitcoin chasing goods and services, meaning the remaining 99% is all 1% more valuable. So it adds up to 100% of the Bitcoin that is chasing goods and services, which is what makes it valuable, or the price go up and down is based on supply and demand. So anyway, great question. Thank you to the person who asked it. Fabulous insights. And hopefully that gives you some insight. And if any of what I covered is not clear, which I know it sounds, it's a super simple question, but it's a complicated answer, especially when you understand the inflationary and deflationary effects of specific amounts of money on an economy. I understand that is just, it's complicated, it's multifaceted, it's hard to understand. So if you have any follow-up questions, leave them in the comments or message me directly, and I'm happy to do follow-on videos. But for now, I hope that helps. And I'm kind of running out of time for this evening, but if I have a little more time, I might try to squeeze 1 or 2 short videos in, but not sure. Might have to save them for tomorrow. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Thanks so much.